We often talk about how those first 100 days of a U.S. presidency can really set the stage, you know?
Absolutely. It's like a tone setter.
Makes you think about moments like, well, FDR back in 33, right? Stepping into the Great Depression. Just wow.
Yeah, a massive crisis right off the bat. Those initial actions become incredibly significant.
Which kind of brings us to our deep dive today. We're looking at the start of Donald Trump's presidency, specifically the economy he walked into, and, well, the promises versus what the source material says happened in those first 100 days.
Right, and the analysis we've reviewed really uses that historical lens you mentioned.
Yeah, it offers quite a perspective.
It does. And, one of the first things the source jumps on is that economic difference. Unlike Roosevelt facing total devastation, the analysis argues Trump inherited, well, what was seen by many as a pretty stable economy.
That's a huge difference in starting conditions.
Crucial for understanding the analysis we're diving into.
Okay, let's get into it. Our focus today, based on the sources, is sort of threefold. First, Trump's handling of international stuff, specifically Ukraine and the Middle East, according to this analysis.
Okay.
Second, his economic moves, trade tariffs are a big one here, and what the source claims the fallout was.
Right, the consequences.
And finally, we'll touch on early signs of public opinion, poll numbers, and there's even a bit in the source about Elon Musk's reported experience back then.
So international, economic, and public reaction, looking at all three gives a much rounder picture of that initial period, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's not just one policy in isolation.
It's how they all connect and how people saw them.
So, yeah, the mission here is really to unpack that early trajectory, just as depicted in our sources. Get behind the headlines a bit. Ready?
Let's do it. International affairs first. Ukraine, you mentioned.
Yeah, let's start there. The source material highlights this significant promise Trump made, right, to basically solve the Ukraine conflict almost immediately.
A very bold claim.
Very. But the analysis we read suggests that instead of things calming down, the situation actually escalated further. It mentions a brief pause in fighting that apparently broke down.
And then Russia allegedly launched more attacks.
That's what the source claims, yes. Without provocation from Ukraine, according to this analysis. And what's interesting is how the source describes the response, or maybe the perceived lack of one from Trump.
Ah, okay. So the source felt there wasn't a strong enough reaction. It characterizes it as a noticeable silence, a lack of decisive action, maybe. It suggests there wasn't much significant political or economic pressure put on Russia at that point. Instead, the focus, according to the source, seemed to stay on just saying the war would end soon, but without clear steps or results. And the analysis suggests this might have impacted, America's global standing.
Raises the question of what if, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
could a different approach early on have changed things? At least that's the perspective offered here.
Yeah, it frames it as a potential missed opportunity.
Okay, so moving over to the Middle East. The source suggests a kind of similar dynamic. Trump arrives suggesting he can fix long-running issues fast, maybe even just by talking to Netanyahu directly.
Another big promise.
Right. But the analysis claims that rather than peace breaking out, some pretty unconventional ideas were apparently floated. Like, the source mentions this idea of moving the population of Gaza to Egypt's Sinai Desert.
Wow, okay. That sounds controversial.
Extremely.
And the source highlights that Egypt, the Palestinian Authorities, the international community, they all reportedly rejected it flat out.
Understandably.
And there was apparently another idea mentioned in the source attributed to Trump, basically taking over Gaza and turning it into like a resort and casino hub, moving the existing population somewhere else.
A resort and casino hub.
That's what the source claims was floated, and it argues these sorts of ideas were seen as much more likely to, stir things up rather than lead to actual solutions.
Yeah, you wonder where those ideas even came from. So, the source seems to be arguing that instead of breakthroughs, the early statements and these reported proposals actually just made things more tense in the Middle East, made the problems potentially harder to solve.
That's the gist of the analysis for that region, yeah.
Okay, let's pivot then. The domestic economy. This was, supposedly Trump's wheelhouse, his background in business.
Right. And the source material makes a point of saying that publications like the Wall Street Journal, often seen as, maybe more Republican-friendly, were acknowledging a pretty strong U.S. economy before Trump took office.
So the setup was good.
The analysis suggests any incoming president would have been stepping into a pretty favorable situation, economically speaking, which sets the stage for looking at what changed.
But then, according to the source, things took a turn. It portrays Trump, who it notes had a history of business bankruptcies, coming into this stable environment and then making a big shift.
The trade tariff.
Exactly. Imposing tariffs on goods from China, from Europe. The source basically argues he kicked off a trade war without a really clear endgame in mind. Why does it say that?
Well, the analysis suggests that China didn't just fold, right? They hit back. Retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, and the source even mentions campaigns against the U.S. online.
So it backfired, according to this view.
The source posits that American industries started facing higher costs because of these tariffs on imported materials. It even suggests some businesses might have faced closure because things just got too expensive. It really questions what the intended goal of the tariffs was versus what actually happened or what reportedly happened.
And the source says it wasn't just businesses feeling it.
No, apparently not. It claims American consumers started seeing prices go up on all sorts of things: cars, clothes, appliances.
Right.
There's even a mention in the source of car companies telling people, buy now before prices go up even more.
Oof. That's not a great sign.
No. And the source then throws out a statistic claiming 71% of Americans felt the economy was bad or just average, and 55% felt their own financial situation had gotten worse in the last 3 months.
Wow, 71% bad or average,
Mhm.
and 55% feeling worse off personally. That suggests a big shift in how people were feeling.
It does, as presented by the source. And the analysis then makes this really stark claim that the month this was written was the worst April for the U.S. economy since the Great Depression.
Since the Great Depression.
That's the claim in the source, yeah. And it reports a loss of $10 trillion in the American market. Huge numbers. And the source directly links this back to those tariff policies.
That is a dramatic assessment. It would be interesting to know exactly how they calculated worst April.
Absolutely. But that's the picture the source paints: pretty bleak consequences from the tariffs.
And it mentions Trump digging in his heels, saying he wouldn't back down on the tariffs, even with these alleged negative effects.
Yes, the source quotes him as being firm on that. And it adds another layer, claiming there was a disconnect, where Trump talked about ongoing trade talks with China, but China reportedly said, nope, no talks unless all tariffs are gone.
So the source suggests the power dynamic in those trade talks might have actually shifted against the U.S.
That's the interpretation offered, yeah. A potential reversal of how the trade fight was maybe expected to go. Now, the source also brings up inflation during this early period.
Right. The analysis notes inflation did dip. I think it says to around 2.4% at one point.
It does, but it immediately adds context.
Which is?
That inflation had already dropped quite a bit, from a high of 9% down to that 2.4% under the previous Biden administration. So the source positions that 2.4% number as coinciding with Trump's election win.
Ah, okay. So not necessarily a result of his policies yet.
According to this analysis, no. And it then claims that from that point, inflation started to creep back up again. The source even alleges that by the time of writing, inflation was back to where it was when Trump first took office, kind of implying, any progress made in controlling prices might have been reversed.
Does the source suggest why it might have started rising again beyond the tariffs?
Not in great detail beyond linking it generally to the economic policies, but it does shift to discussing Trump's reported interactions with the Fed chair, Jerome Powell.
Ah, yes, the Federal Reserve.
The source claims Trump was putting pressure on Powell to lower interest rates.
Which Powell resisted.
Resisted, yeah. Emphasizing the Fed needs to be independent. The source even mentions Trump apparently considered firing Powell, but didn't go through with it.
That raises interesting questions about, the White House versus the central bank and who controls economic levers.
Definitely. Different views on how to manage the economy.
Now, the source also briefly mentions a couple of other controversies from that time, right?
Yeah.
Something about the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, just briefly. There are claims in the source about issues with alcohol consumption and also alleged leaks of sensitive military info to journalists.
Leaks? That sounds serious.
Very. Potentially compromising national security, the source suggests. And it claims that when this was apparently brought up, the secretary downplayed how serious the leaked information was, even though military rules supposedly marked it as highly sensitive.
Serious allegations indeed.
And there's also a quick mention of the Secretary of Commerce allegedly advising people to invest in certain private companies, which, raises potential ethics flags about public officials and private finances.
Right, blurring lines there. So these are presented as sort of contributing to the overall picture of the early administration.
Just brief anecdotes in the source, yeah.
Okay, let's talk about public opinion then, and maybe influential figures. The source claims Trump's approval ratings took a nosedive pretty quickly.
It says despite coming in with relatively decent numbers, his popularity apparently fell faster in the first 100 days than any president before him.
Faster than anyone.
Wow.
Specifically on the economy.
Yeah, the source says satisfaction with the economy dropped from over 50% down to 38%, and satisfaction with handling inflation down to just 33%.
Ouch. So even people who maybe voted for him based on the economy started to worry.
That's what the source suggests. As prices reportedly went up and maybe job growth seemed to slow, confidence eroded, even among his initial supporters.
According to this analysis, what does that rapid drop really signify?
Well, the way the source presents these numbers, it suggests a pretty sharp loss of public trust in his economic stewardship early on. It draws a direct line between those reported price hikes and slower job growth and the fall in approval.
A perception, at least, that policies were having negative effects.
That's the connection the source makes.
And then there's that really eye-popping claim about Elon Musk.
Ah, right. That was striking.
The source describes Musk, who, it says, gave a lot of money to support Trump's campaign, allegedly wanting to, back away because of Trump's actions after taking office. And it claims Musk lost a massive amount of money, reportedly over $1 billion a day during this period. A huge hit to his net worth.
$1 billion a day, that's hard to fathom.
It is. Now, the source is careful to say, correlation isn't causation, but it definitely heavily implies a link between Musk's support for Trump and these huge reported losses.
So it's suggesting even very prominent wealthy supporters might have had second thoughts early on based on this analysis. That seems to be the implication, yes. It raises questions about what makes influential people change their minds or their public alignment.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together as we wrap up. The source we've been discussing draws this really stark contrast, doesn't it, between Trump's first 100 days and someone like FDR.
Absolutely. Keeps coming back to that point. Roosevelt inherited an absolute disaster and took bold action, whereas the source argues Trump inherited a decent economy and then, in their view, made decisions that harmed it.
Right, and it reiterates that lack of claimed progress on Ukraine and the heightened tensions reported in the Middle East, despite those initial big promises.
No quick fixes there, according to this analysis.
And on the economy, the picture painted by the source is one of trade wars started by tariffs, which allegedly hurt American consumers and businesses rising prices, fears about factories closing.
Plus, those polling numbers we mentioned, the 71% feeling the economy was bad or average, the 55% feeling personally worse off, and that dramatic claim about the worst April since the Depression and the $10 trillion market loss.
The serious claims.
And finally, that reported drop in Trump's own approval ratings on the economy and inflation, alongside that specific dramatic claim about Elon Musk's alleged losses tied to his support.
So it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Here's maybe a final thought. If you take these initial promises and then look at the outcomes described in our source across international affairs, the economy, public feeling in those first 100 days, what might these early trends, as seen through the lens of this source, hint at for the longer-term story of that presidency?
Yeah, it really makes you consider how interconnected everything is and how those early months can set a course, for better or worse, according to different analyses.
The complexity is definitely something to chew on.